Namaste, people. Welcome to another episode of the show Get Set Green Season 2. I'm your host, Pooja Arvi. In this podcast, we talk about sustainability, and this show is completely dedicated to change makers who are working to improve the environment through tackling climate change, recycling, upcycling, and various innovations. In this episode, we have a special guest, Paul Brown, a retired professor emeritus of physiology from the United States who has specialized in neuroscience. He has studied mass suicide as a result of ecological overshoot and overconsumption of natural resources. He has also published books such as Notes from a Dying Planet and Notes from a Dead Planet. Welcome to the show.
Namaste.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so sweet of you. So, Paul, my first question for you is being a neuroscientist, nowadays we all are going through this, climate change aspects. Everyone, I feel like, is already quite aware of the fact. But can you tell us from a neuroscientist point of view how the things change or how can we define these things? So, can you please tell us that part?
Yes, my perspective is from the viewpoint of evolution of human consciousness, which evolved from the other forms of consciousness that preceded us in our ancestors, and which then developed through the course of our history or prehistory, from the time that we first spread from Africa into Asia. And then from the by a human perspective, the long period in which we spread throughout the world, in the process, killing a large fraction of the larger animals on the planet. So this is not something new. We have in our heritage a tendency to destroy the ecosystems that we invade. The other aspect of our heritage is that, like all other animals and plants, we produce more offspring than are strictly necessary for perpetuation of the species, because historically, and today in the case of other species, most of the offspring don't survive. They are consumed by predators, or they die of disease, or changes in the habitat. The change when we came along was that we have the intelligence and adaptability and skills necessary to evade that fate. We have a high survival rate, and as a consequence, we have increased our consumption of resources all over the planet and increased our numbers. As a result, we're now consuming more resources than the planet can replenish. If you would include the pollution that's produced by burning fossil fuels and by dumping our waste as a form of resource consumption, then the pattern has reached the point where our species is now consuming more than our planet can provide. This is particularly true in the more economically developed countries of the world, where consumption is such that, for example, in Sweden, if everybody lived the way the Swedes do, we would need something like 4 planets in order to be sustainable.
Yeah.
The problem, of course, is that this is a pattern that is part of our genome, part of our DNA. This is something that we have to use our intelligence to overcome, because our instincts are such that we will continue to do that right until the very end. The other aspect of our behavior that is going to prevent our reversing the ecological collapse is our current economic system, which is capitalism. Capitalism requires growth in order to make profits. And growth is not possible, infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet, as many people have said. So we have to overcome the capitalist impulse and base our economy more on what actually provides well-beings for both humans and for the other species on the planet. That will be a major challenge because the oligarchs, those who run the world, those who have the power and the money, own the means of not only production, but the means of government and the means of public information. And as a consequence, we cannot succeed until we overcome the oligarchs. And that is the subject of the book that I'm working on now.
So great. Yeah, I do agree on the point of, like how the consumerism is increasing, and also you touched on the point that infinite growth is not possible when we have finite resources. And also the rate at which the resource depletion is happening to refurbish the Earth's capacity to refurbish is decreasing, and also there is no time lapse between that, for to recover from the loss which happened earlier. So I feel that's really a valid point, Paul. And also, understanding from a neuroscientist point of view, how would you like to say, what is the main influence that human being is having on this climate change? For example, let's say, like the point as you mentioned, that we aspire for growth in this consumerism world. So how is that, affecting the growth, or how is that mindset influencing on this? Can you explain that part for us?
Sure. Basically, capitalism requires growth because that is the basis for profits. Continued production at a steady pace does not produce the kind of profits that are required by investors. And that means that investors are strongly motivated to perpetuate the capitalist system in order to continue making their profits. Now, the 1% who have the highest income are the ones who in fact control the countries of the world through their support of politicians who will pursue their causes for them. And this is particularly visible in the United States, where the Republican Party is, without any shame, pandering to the 1%, the oligarchs, as they are known. And they're having remarkable success. They have convinced the population through the media that are owned by the oligarchs that they are victims of too much government, while simultaneously increasing governmental control over our freedoms. This is a paradox which their followers are too brainwashed to understand. So as a consequence, they believe that their freedoms are being increased when in fact they're being decreased. And we are heading toward a fascist future. This is true of the Western world in general, as a matter of fact. You can see it in Europe and South America, and even in Australia and New Zealand, although to differing degrees. The obstacle to confronting them with the falsity of their arguments, the misrepresentations, is the fact that they own the media. And so it's only through channels like your podcast, which are very valuable, that we can get the truth out to the people. And so that's one reason why I'm very grateful for your podcast.
Thanks, Paul, for your kind words. Yeah.
Well, you're performing an extremely valuable service, along with your colleagues in what's called the alternative media. Those alternative media are, in fact, the real media, because the traditional media have been taken over by the oligarchs. And there's very little in the way of truthful discussion of any integrity in the traditional media.
Yeah, Paul, today we can see that the amount of news which is spread, it's very difficult to understand the transparency behind it and as well as who is influencing that and how much should we actually believe it. That's there. So, speaking of which, from your 20 years of experience in this particular field and studying various ecological aspects of climate change and how exactly is this, affecting the ecosystem in today's date currently. So, can you tell us, 3 points from your experience, how you have seen it in your own way to our audience to better understand from what you have learned in this whole journey?
Of course. Um, First of all, I'm living in Mexico now. I used to live in West Virginia in the United States. That's in the central part of the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States, just south of Pittsburgh. And the ecological changes there have been visible even back when I was writing my first book in 2006, Notes from a Dying Planet. The temperature was going up, the weather was becoming more chaotic, and species were starting to disappear. The trend has continued, as you know, and in the United States now, we have suffered major flooding due to hurricanes hovering over for longer periods in fixed positions and dumping vast quantities of rain as a result of climate change, and drought in the West, followed by extreme downpours that caused major flooding in the Northeast and central northern United States. We've seen violent snowfall, and in the South, we've seen tornadoes and drought that are unprecedented in their frequency and severity. Here in Mexico, where I've lived for the past 10 years or so, when I first came here, I'm on the Pacific coast, and it was a common sight to see whales offshore and dolphins playing in the water and pelicans diving for fish. They are all gone now. They aren't there in this part of Mexico. Instead, we have such bad pollution of the water that ocean spray is spreading bacteria inland, both here and north of here in San Diego, for several kilometers, spreading disease-causing bacteria from the polluted water. So these are just some of the changes that I personally have seen, and I'm sure that you could relate amazing changes in your part of the world. For example, not too far from where you are, Pakistan suffered such severe flooding that 1/3 of the country was flooded, and they are still in the process of recovering, which will probably take decades. The problem with the process of recovery is that as people struggle to return to normal life, temperatures are going to continue increasing and weather is going to continue getting more violent, which will interfere with those recovery processes and which will also interfere with any attempts to reverse the ecological collapse that we are undergoing.
Yeah, the things which you mentioned, I can see, like, I can relate to like a major portion of it, because as you mentioned, the number of blue whales or aquatic animals, they are like dying and they are under the verge of extinction. Many of the like rare species are like out of nowhere now. And it's not like it is happening today. Gradually, the rate at which extinction is happening is way, way higher than the earlier years now. And I feel like it's an alarming bell to each and every one of us to start looking around, paying attention, and to be aware and, take responsibility for what's happening around us, because this is our duty to preserve this, and as well as utilize it in such a way that you are not engulfing or over consuming the resources, and you be mindful of it. This is what I understand, because only by this can we actually bring some change. Unless we are really aware of the fact what is being destroyed, I think that is the first point for us to start, looking forward to the coming years. Yes, Paul, like the examples you took were really relevant to the situation. Maybe I can add one or two to that. Is like the temperatures, like it's very adverse now. Like nowadays, you can see raining in like in this hot summers, and sometimes even harsh sun. The temperatures are going varying, like it's like tremendous change. It's not like normal year by year change. It's very quite terrific change, I can say. And also, apart from temperatures, the rainfall is also getting disturbed. The pattern of cycle, how it is to happen, is also getting varied. So the soil quality is deteriorating day by day, because of which we are unable to get, good quality of food, and it ends up in the loop, like the rainfall, the food which you grow by that, and ultimately the food chain where you are consuming that food. So everything is getting disturbed. So it's a complex web, and it's really difficult to address one part, keeping the other rest of the parts, like excluding. That is very difficult. So that's what I feel. So, Paul, I would like to know that since we already understand, the extent of the problem now, I can say, if not exactly, at least approximately, we understand it. So, according to you, what will be our ideal situation to be, actions to be taken, so that, coming forward, we are working towards in tackling these issues?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned the tragedies that have occurred in India. They bring to mind the suicides of many thousands of farmers that have occurred in your country, and the deaths due to heat that have recently occurred.
Yes, yes.
You have my sympathy. With regard to what we can do in the years to come, and we don't have many years left. With regard to that, I'd like to say that first of all, you have to understand that it is a problem that is caused. The overconsumption is primarily by the oligarch, by the people who have an obsession with gaining money and power and exercising it. The top 1% are consuming far more than their proportion. And this applies to the wealthy economies. The richest nations are consuming far more than their reasonable proportion. In the less developed countries, they are not the problem, even though they need to control their expanding population, just as all countries need to do, not just them. They in some countries, the average footprint, ecological footprint, is equivalent to for one person, is equivalent to one American refrigerator. Think about that. One person in a developing country, a poor developing country, has as much ecological footprint as one refrigerator in the United States. So we have to take that into mind when we consider what the remedies are. And we all know what the remedies are. We have to stop burning carbon. No excuses. Absolutely zero excuses. Anything that requires the burning of carbon will have to be electrified using sources of renewable energy. And I'm so sad to say that the United States is far behind where it should be. So is Europe. India is way behind. And in fact, India and China are increasing their consumption of coal. The United States is increasing its production of oil. This is totally suicidal. The other thing that we need to do is stop making goods that we don't need. If we don't make them, then we don't buy them and we don't use them. The only way that I can see governments, well, first of all, I should mention individual action is, of course, important, but the only way that I can see ecological recovery is for governments to act with their much greater powers to use both the resources, economic and otherwise, and human resources, and to use laws, legislation, enforcement to enact big changes in our societies. That will mean the end of capitalism, because we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and that is what capitalism requires. There are countries that do have a more socialist approach, have been extremely successful, and there's no excuse for the continuation of capitalism, which is there predominantly to feed the oligarchs.
Yes.
And speaking of oligarchs, how can we possibly even inform the public as long as the media are controlled by them? How can we restore the kind of conservation that is opposed by the fascist governments, and especially the elements like the Republican Party in the United States? They have fought every measure of conservation that has come along, and very successfully so. The first thing we have to do is to overcome the oligarchs. Once we have done that, then our governments have to embark on individual action, that individual government action, and abandon the smoke and mirrors and fraudulent activities of COP 26, 27, 28, 29, which are run by corporations and run by corporate cronies in our governments. They make promises, they have serious discussions, they are very solemn, they set goals which are unenforceable. And it's very clear that the COP meetings are strictly for show. They have absolutely no value. And governments simply have to abandon their cronyism. They have to abandon, for example, free trade agreements, which give corporations literally more power than nations in disputes over losses suffered by corporations, those poor corporations whose rights are even greater than the rights of individual human beings. I don't know if you realize, but as a result of these trade agreements, we have situations where a government can pass laws to protect the health of its people, and those laws can be fought in tribunals that are controlled by the corporations, in order for the corporations to make up their losses as a result of those laws. And those laws can be overcome. Literally, the corporations can override the sovereignty of individual nations. So we have to stop the oligarchs. But once we've done that, then our governments can embark on emergency measures that involve every citizen, that involve the creation of agencies, war boards, whatever you want to call them, similar to the board that was so successful in the United States, converting all of U.S. industry to the war effort in World War II. And during those times, they had rationing, they had recycling campaigns, and they converted the automobile industry into a very powerful producer of weapons of war. Now what we need is similar powers for us to demilitarize, to use the members of the military and civilians to restore damaged habitats and to implement renewable energy to replace fossil fuel consumption. That will be the only way that we can recover from the ecological collapse that is occurring right now, which includes, as you mentioned, a rate of extinctions that is more than 1,000 times the normal background rate of extinction.
Yeah. So it also boils down to the point that each one of us have our role to play in this contribution, that each one should be aware of what they are doing and what impact it's making on the planet. I think that's where we end up on this conversation. And yeah, to summarize this whole conversation which we had was really to, understand like what we need and what production actually we are like meant to be using it, and which is actually be needed is what is the focus of our time now. So thank you for your views and your perspective on this climate change. Thanks a lot for joining us, Paul.
Anytime. And if your readers want an alternative source of information, I have a free news feed called Dead Planet News, and they can subscribe by sending me an email at pbrown4348@gmail.com.
Yes, so you heard it, guys. If you want to know more, please connect to him, send him an email. So that was all, Paul. Thank you so much for your time. It was pleasure to meet you today.
Thank you as well.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment. I would love to read them. You can find me on Instagram at getsetgreen.in. You can DM or drop a mail on getsetgreen.in@gmail.com if you have any suggestions. The 3 R's of sustainable living are reuse, recycle, and most importantly, reduce. Stay tuned until next episode. Bye. Take care.